Madrid, 1834. The king is dead, but your work is not yet done. You have been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII. The task that awaits you there is so strange, so unprecedented, that an icy chill of doubt begins to seep into the corners of your mind, making you question your own sanity. The Queen Regent, Maria Christina, stands before you, her face a mask of grief, her tear-streaked eyes pleading. Her voice is but a whisper, but the words she speaks make the air freeze in your lungs and the blood turn to ice in your veins. Your hands tremble as you approach the bed where Ferdinand's body lies. The room is filled with the heavy, cloying scent of lilies and death. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave. His face, frozen in a death mask, seems to hold an echo of the cruel, contemptuous smirk you so often saw in life. But it is not his face that commands your attention, but something else, hidden beneath the heavy silk sheets. The thing that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, his countless betrayals. An anatomical monstrosity, a secret historians will whisper about for centuries, but would never dare commit a single line to the official records. Only whispers, only guesses, only a chilling horror. This is Ferdinand, 7th member, his grotesquely large, bizarrely formed manhood, the source of his deepest, most searing shame and, simultaneously, the most perverse, dark pride a man could ever harbor. As you begin the sacred and repulsive process of embalming, feeling the cold metal of your tools through your gloves, your mind drifts like a shadow to the stories you heard in the palace corridors. Tales of the special pillows required to accommodate the anomaly, of screaming brides on their wedding nights, their cries echoing through the royal bedchambers before falling silent. Of the desperate, agonizing attempts to produce an air against nature's cruel irony, which had turned him into a caricature of a man. You realize you are preserving not just flesh and blood. You are preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself misshapen, excessive, and insatiable. A reign that ultimately proved ruinous to everything it touched, leaving only wreckage and pain in its wake. To truly understand Ferdinand VII, you must first grasp this. He was born cursed, not by ancient sorcery or divine wrath. No, his curse was the venomous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons, generation after generation, had mindlessly married, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, weaving a genetic nightmare. This nightmare manifested in everything, from the whispering madness of mental instability to the stark, shocking physical deformities that warped both body and soul. Ferdinand emerged from this toxic, decaying bloodline as the living, breathing embodiment of royal decline, its apotheosis. He was born in the Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, were first cousins. Theirs was not a union of love, but merely another turn in a vicious cycle that had spun for centuries. The genetic lottery was rigged from the start, with no chance of a winning ticket, and Ferdinand would pay the most intimate, monstrous, and humiliating price imaginable. As the boy began to mature into a young man, a cold, merciless truth pierced his world. What was growing within him was not just a part of his body, but a monstrous, mocking anomaly. With each passing month, each year, it grew, defying not just medical texts, but common sense. By his adolescence, the whispers of court physicians had become a hum, an obsessive and constant drone that filled every corner of the palace. He heard their voices, low and strained, discussing the royal anomaly, something so massive, so strange in its shape, that it seemed an alien thing torn from a nightmare. In the dim light of stuffy, herb-scented offices, thick with fear, he felt their gazes, clinical, detached, yet full of a hidden horror. One of them, with a trembling hand, would scratch letters onto parchment, and though he did not read the Latin aloud, Ferdinand felt each word like an icy blade describing him. His Royal Highness suffers from an organ of such extraordinary size and peculiar shape that Congress may prove difficult. The echo of these words pulsed in his head, leaving a burning trail of humiliation. Another, with a cruder but equally merciless voice, compared it to a billiard cue, thin as a stick of sealing wax at its base, then abruptly, monstrously thickening to the size of a man's fist, and long enough, he'd overheard, to serve as a walking stick. The image, absurd and vile, was seared into his mind forever, making his insides clench with nausea. He felt the burden, this unnatural weight that was always with him, cold and alien. The psychological toll was devastating. He saw the paintings on the palace walls, depictions of ideal men carved from marble, with their elegant, moderate forms that were considered a mark of nobility and refinement. Then he would look at himself, at his body, at this grotesque, monstrous part that made him a freak, a joke, a mistake of nature. What in another world, another time, might have been a source of pride, here, in this world of classical standards, became the source of his deepest, most unbearable shame. He felt this shame sear his skin, seeping into every cell, poisoning him from within. Ferdinand. Childhood was not just a life, but a series of lessons in dysfunction that would have broken anyone. But they forged him. He saw his father, Charles IV, a blurry, perpetually absent figure, whisked away on hunting trips, leaving behind only the scent of gunpowder and dog fur, preferring the rustle of leaves and the baying of hounds to the whispers of ministers. He saw his mother, Maria Louisa, a woman of insatiable appetites, her heavy, cloying perfume mingling with the scent of another's sweat. She made no secret of her affair with Manuel de Godoy, his brash, smug presence eclipsing even the king. Young Ferdinand watched this daily, silent humiliation, absorbing it like a sponge. He was learning how power slips from weak hands, how easily betrayals are made, and how fragile, painfully fragile, trust is. But it was his physical anomaly, this constant burning mark, that truly shaped him. The court seemed to breathe in whispers. He heard them everywhere, in the empty corridors, behind the heavy velvet drapes, even in the thrum of courtly balls. Servants, passing by, would cover their mouths, and he could hear their quiet, snide chuckles. Courtiers, with their strained smiles, would make subtle, venomous jokes, their eyes flicking over him, full of a hidden scorn. And he felt how foreign diplomats, their quills scratching on paper in the dead of night, reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. He was an object of ridicule, his most private self a source of amusement for others. This humiliation, constant and pervasive, bred a deep, festering resentment within him. It pulsed like a wound, slowly but surely, turning into a cold, merciless rage, and he felt that one day it would erupt. The world around him warped, becoming a distorted mirror. Every deferential bow from a subject felt like a mockery, a well-rehearsed taunt. The formal addresses of his tutors, their velvety voices, were just a backdrop for unspoken jokes. He saw it in the strained smiles of potential brides, in the slight tremor of their lips, the fleeting glint in their eyes that spoke of hidden amusement. They were laughing. He felt it, with every fiber of his being, 1,000 invisible needles, even when their faces were impassive and their gazes blank. The air around him vibrated with their silent contempt, a low, constant hum beneath the majestic arches of the palace. Over the years, as his own body betrayed him, a cold void grew inside. He felt it, a tight, aching knot of shame and rage. He withdrew, recoiling from the probing stares of his tutors, their concerned murmurs sounding like the buzzing of flies. He learned to strike, to lash out. A clumsy move from a servant, a dropped goblet, a gaze held a moment too long, and a swift, brutal retribution would follow. The rustle of paper as dismissal orders were signed, the muffled cries of those led away. He savoured the sudden silence, the trembling fear in the eyes of those who remained. This was power, a hot, searing heat in his veins, a counter to the icy, gnawing impotence that lived beneath his skin. He would make them feel something, anything but that mocking pity. One afternoon, a sharp, creaking sound of an opening door, a gasp. His own breath caught in his throat, a bird trapped in a cage. He spun around, heart hammering against his ribs. A young page, eyes wide, was frozen in the doorway. He had seen him. He had seen it. The air grew thick, suffocating. Shame, hot and searing, flooded through him, instantly transmuting into a monstrous rage. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. This boy, this child, had witnessed his deepest humiliation. A low growl escaped his throat. The boy's frightened sob was a tiny, insignificant sound, not just a dismissal. No, the sharp crack of a whip. The boy's screams, echoing, muffled, through the castle walls. The silent, tear-streaked faces of his family, cast out of their home, their lives ruined. The message, carved in fear, was clear. No one could see. No one could know and remain unpunished. The time for marriage arrived, a suffocating blanket of expectation, and with it, a cold, clinical reality. The hushed consultations of the royal physicians. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal physician, with his knowing, sympathetic gaze, his fingers surprisingly gentle, yet just as ruthlessly probing. Ferdinand lay on the cool linen, the harsh lamplight highlighting every detail, every flaw. He heard the doctor's low mumble, the scratch of a quill on parchment, describing the monstrosity. He imagined the words later, secret, damning. His Majesty's member, of a most unusual configuration, the base no wider than a man's thumb, yet it expands to a girth that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds any recorded human specimen. 10 inches, even in repose, growing considerably when aroused, but of greatest concern, the peculiar curvature, the apparent extra growths of tissue, serving no discernible biological function. Each word, a fresh brand of humiliation seared onto his skin. The future, once a tapestry of power and lineage, was now frayed, unraveling before his eyes. Husband? Father? The very words mocked him. Normal intimacy? Impossible. The cold pronouncement, accompanied by a shake of the head, a sympathetic sigh. Not without intervention, not without apparatus. And so the whispers began. The hushed consultations with the royal craftsmen, the secret commissions, marital aids, they called them. The words, a bitter taste on his tongue, a grotesque euphemism for the devices designed to bridge the chasm of his deformity. Specially crafted pillows, strange, unsettling supports, cold, unyielding shapes that would allow him to function, to perform his duty. to avoid inflicting serious injury on the women he was meant to cherish. A future defined not by love or passion, but by cold, mechanical engineering. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. The pressure mounted, slow and inexorable. The physical flaws were just the tip of an iceberg, concealing a chasm of despair that seeped through the thick bedroom walls, poisoning every corner of his life. He became a prisoner of shadows, obsessed with whispers of potions and elixirs that promised the impossible, to restore his anatomy to normalcy, to breathe fertility into his barren body. The creak of hidden doors, the muffled footsteps in the night. This was how court alchemists and foreign doctors arrived secretly in Madrid. Each one brought with them the echo of unfulfilled hopes, promising miracle cures that inevitably turned to dust at the bottom of empty vials. Fortunes flowed like sand through his fingers, spent on these charlatan remedies. The taste of chalk, the bitterness of earth. He swallowed concoctions of ground rhinoceros horn, crushed pearls, and rare herbs that were supposed to regulate his royal essence. Some potions promised to shrink his member to what was considered a normal size. Others, conversely, swore to increase his virility, despite its unusual shape. Every drop, every powder was useless. But Ferdinand's desperation, cloying and suffocating, made him easy prey for the whispering fraudsters, for those who saw only his crown and not his ravaged soul. 1802. The ringing of bells, the roar of the crowd, the rustle of silk. He married his cousin, Princess Maria Antonia, of Naples and Sicily. The marriage was a mere calculation, arranged when they were both still adolescents. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid enveloped in a haze of romantic notions about her future husband. She had heard some of his supporters call him the Desired. And in her young imagination, he appeared as a fairy tale prince, a hero of ballads who was about to enter her life. The wedding ceremony was dazzling, opulent, as befitting the union of two royal houses. The thick sound of the organ shook the cathedral vaults, and the streets of Madrid hummed with festive cries, with laughter, with music. The young couple, clad in brocade and gold, seemed the perfect royal union, carved from marble. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, her eyes shining with the sincere joy of a new life. Ferdinand, for his part, behaved almost normally in public, charming, attentive, reservedly romantic. But royal weddings, like all fairy tales, have an end, and then the wedding nights begin. The first omen of disaster crept into the silence when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. The royal bedchamber required special preparations, some sort of equipment the ladies did not understand, but they were assured it was merely an ancient custom for royal couples. And so, custom-made pillows, bottles of oils and ointments, and then various contraptions that looked more medical than romantic were brought into the room. Maria Antonia, sheltered from the world, as innocent as most royal brides of her era, understood nothing. Her education was strictly religious, focused on languages, music, and the subtleties of court etiquette. The basic facts of married life had been explained to her by nervous old women whose voices trembled and whose words were as vague as the morning mist over a river. They themselves knew little of the specific difficulties that awaited her. When Ferdinand entered the bedroom, the air froze. Only the flickering candles, casting bizarre shadows, danced on the walls. Maria Antonia's first sight of her husband His naked body crashed over her like an icy waterfall. Her breath caught, her eyes widened in horror, filling with an unspeakable scream. Then the scream erupted, sharp and piercing. It tore through the ensuing silence. She recoiled, pressing her back against the cold, rough wall, her fingers clutching desperately at an invisible support. "Monster! Monster!" she choked out, hoarsely, raggedly, until her ladies-in-waiting, frozen in the doorway, began to whisper, fearing for her sanity. Her own pulse thundered in her temples, drowning out their frightened voices, turning them into a vague, buzzing background noise. The scent of fear, sharp and metallic, filled her lungs. What she saw was unthinkable, unimaginable. A huge, writhing mass, twisted and crowned with strange growths, seemed something alien, torn from a nightmarish engraving, not part of a human body. Nothing in her sheltered, protected world could have prepared her for this. Not the drawings, not the whispers of servants, not the vague premonitions. Its size was terrifying, but it was its bizarre, almost otherworldly shape, the way it bent and coiled in the dim light, that finally broke her composure. The world tilted, the floor giving way beneath her feet. What followed was devoid of even a hint of intimacy. It was a procedure, clinical, soulless. The footsteps of doctors, their quiet, clipped voices, whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. They entered the room, bringing with them the smell of medicine and indifference. Special pillows, soft but alien, were arranged on the bed, their muffled rustle filling the air. Then the oils, cold, sliding on her skin, their sharp, herbal scent mingling with the smell of fear and sweat. And it began, a process more like preparation for surgery than for a wedding night. Every gesture was measured, every glance emotionless. She felt like a puppet, a body to be prepared for some ritual. Through a fogged consciousness, she felt every moment the huge pillow placed under Ferdinand to support him. Her own body, now an instrument, a battlefield. The pain, searing, tearing. It came in waves, forcing her to gasp for air. The doctor's whispers, their instructions, seemed a distant, meaningless drone. And then, salvation. A viscous, cloyingly sweet liquid brought to her lips. Laudanum. Its warm waves spread slowly through her veins, blunting the sharp edges of reality, turning the pain into a distant echo and the horror into a murky, unreal dream. The world blurred, sounds muffled, and she sank into a viscous, saving darkness. The psychological wound was deep. The revulsion she could not hide only added fuel to the fire of his paranoia. He became even more twisted, his touches even rougher, devoid of any tenderness. For her, each wedding night was a new trauma, leaving a deep, bleeding scar. She felt broken, hollowed out. Laudanum became her only refuge, the only way to silence the nightmare. Its sweetish, bitter taste became the flavor of her daily life. She took more and more often, until it was the only thing that helped her breathe, the only wall between her and the unbearable reality. Addiction enveloped her like a sticky, suffocating web. Their attempts to produce an air became a ritualized nightmare, again and again, with a tragic, suffocating regularity. As evening fell, Ferdinand would summon his doctors. Their footsteps echoed in the corridors, harbingers of the approaching torture. The bedroom was prepared again, the same pillows, the same oils, the same smell of medicine and anticipation. She was given laudanum, just enough to make her body compliant, but not so much that she would fall into a catatonic state. She felt her consciousness slowly drift away, leaving only a shell. The procedure was carried out with cold, clinical efficiency, without emotion, without words, only quiet sighs and the creak of the bed. And then, relief. Brief, bitter. They would retreat to different wings of the palace, each to their own prison, to lick their wounds, to recover from this nightly ordeal, until the next night brought the same horror. Months dragged on, each day counting a new drop of despair, until the years began to press down on Ferdinand's shoulders with unbearable weight. The emptiness in the royal chambers, where no child's laughter rang, screamed louder than any crowd. He knew, felt in every fibre of his being, that his wife's cold, unconcealed revulsion was like an icy shell, preventing life from taking root. It permeated the air, the silence of their nights, and he suffocated in it. To break this feminine weakness, this wall, he began to search for ever stranger, ever more desperate paths. His orders, recorded in the dry ink of court chroniclers, were far more vivid in his memory. He saw them, special restraints, made of rough leather and smooth, cold silk. He heard them creak as they were tightened. He felt his own fingers tremble as he touched these contraptions, crafted by the same artisans who bent royal saddles and forged hunting arrowheads, as if his wife were a wild, untamable beast that needed to be broken. He saw her eyes, wide open in the semi-darkness, devoid of any fire, fixed on the ceiling as the straps held her, preventing her from pulling away, not even allowing a sigh to express her silent suffering. This was his way of controlling, his attempt to break the invisible resistance. Days and nights merged into one continuous pursuit of an answer, of a sign. The king became obsessed with the heavens, with their invisible threads. He hunched over dusty astrological charts, inhaling the scent of old paper and dried herbs, consulting with astronomers whose voices were as dry as the desert, and with astrologers whose promises sounded like sweet poison. Even practitioners of the dark arts, their gazes murky and their hands clammy, found their way to his ear, promising to realign the stars so they would converge favorably over his bed. The palace, once filled with the clinking of goblets and light laughter, now hummed with the whispers of charlatans selling murky potions that smelled of earth and rot, shiny amulets, cold and heavy in the palm, and promises of ritualistic ceremonies. All of them promised one thing: to overcome the curse that he felt was linked to his own hideous anatomy. That word, spoken by someone long ago, had burrowed under his skin, burning him from within. One episode was etched particularly deep. A traveling mystic, whose clothes smelled of unfamiliar spices and whose eyes were as deep as wells, appeared from the distant east. He bowed, whispering words that made Ferdinand's heart leap. He spoke of divine favor, of the dragon's rod with which the king was blessed, and of the need for only the right rituals to unlock its potential. And Ferdinand believed. For 3 long months, the palace was filled with the thick, cloying scent of foreign incense. At night, monotonous chants that made the head spin were heard, and they, the king and queen, assumed strange, uncomfortable positions, supposedly drawn from ancient Chinese texts. Cold sweat trickled down Maria Antonia's temples, but he didn't notice, didn't want to notice. A searing hope was kindling in his chest. Twice, against all odds, against all reason, Maria Antonia became pregnant. The news of each pregnancy swept through the court like an electric shock, causing an explosion of jubilation. The royal chambers filled with joyful cries, and Ferdinand's confidence soared like a bird finally freed from its cage. Spain held its breath, waiting for an heir. feeling his presence in every rustle of the wind. But each time, inevitably, the end came. Devastating miscarriages. Not just a loss, it was a blow, dull and heavy, to the very heart. The muffled, choked sobs of Maria Antonia were heard, and Ferdinand felt the ground give way beneath his feet, a black, gaping hole forming in his soul, leaving them both more mutilated, more traumatized than ever before. The silence that followed was deafening, saturated with the smell of unfulfilled hopes and bitter tears. In 1804, as the pale sun was just beginning to break through the heavy drapes, in her 4th month of pregnancy, her body seized in a spasm, sharp and unbearable. A sudden, sticky heat spread down her thighs, followed by a cold. A deep, lingering cold that penetrated to the very bone, leaving behind only emptiness and a tremor. The court physicians, their voices hushed like the whisper of wind in empty corridors, spoke of unusual strains and a fragile constitution. She saw their serious faces, their eyes full of hidden knowledge, and felt their words, light as feathers, settle like heavy dust on her tormented soul. She knew, she felt with every cell that it was not her own fragility, but another's strange, inexplicable anomaly, an alien pain that was tearing her apart from the inside. Every touch, every movement intended for procreation turned into torture, leaving invisible wounds on her body and a burning, unbearable shame in her soul. A year later, in 1805, it happened again. But this time, it was worse, much worse. The child grew inside her almost to term, its faint kicks a tiny hope flickering in a fog of pain. Then came the labor, hours of agony. A scream trapped in her throat, tearing her apart from within. The smell of blood, thick, cloying, suffocating, filled the room, soaked the sheets, seeped into her skin. She felt her own body tear, felt life drain out of her with the red torrent, leaving only numbness and cold. Then, silence. A deafening, oppressive silence in which only her own ragged, hoarse gasp could be heard. She never recovered. Never. Laudanum became her only companion, its bitter taste her only comfort. The world around her blurred, sounds dulled, colors faded. She became a ghost, gliding through the palace halls, her footsteps unheard, her gaze empty. His reaction was a shock. Cold and sharp as a blade, it pierced her numbed soul. No compassion, no warmth, only accusations, sharp as thorns, digging into her flesh. He saw her not as a victim, but as a saboteur. His confidence was unshakable, his voice firm, as he spoke of her deliberate sabotage. She heard his words, each one a blow, substances to prevent, intentional movements, secret liberal sympathies. Each accusation burned like a brand, leaving a searing mark on her consciousness. She, who had dreamed of an heir, who had suffered, bled, nearly died, was now a traitor, an enemy. The whispers. They began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but soon filled the entire palace. Whispers, like snakes, slithered along the stone walls, seeped under doors, coiled around her mind. She felt those gazes, those unspoken words that now hung in the air like a poisonous fog. They destroyed what little was left of her sanity. And so, she began to believe that she was cursed, that her body, this vessel of pain and suffering, rejected Ferdinand's seed for a reason, that it was a punishment, for some unspoken sin, for a divine displeasure whose name she could not find. The final months of her life were spent in almost constant prayer. Her knees ached from the cold stone. Her fingers clutched her rosary until her knuckles turned white. She prayed, whispered, begged for forgiveness, for sins she had not committed, for crimes she did not know. But there was no answer, only silence and emptiness. When Maria Antonia faded away in May 1807, she was only 21. The official cause was fever and complications due to her fragile constitution. But the truth was far more terrible. She died of despair, her body mutilated by years of unbearable physical pain and sexual trauma, her mind crushed by drug addiction and cruel psychological abuse, simply refused to exist. Her last breath was not a struggle, but a release. The silence that followed was the only true peace she had ever known. Even in death, Maria Antonia found no peace, only the cold silence of her chambers, saturated with the scent of wilting lilies, carried not grief, but a new, acrid flavor, the taste of Ferdinand's paranoia. Scarcely had the last church bells fallen silent, scarcely had the footsteps of the mourners faded, when whispers began to creep like poisonous ivy along the marble corridors of the palace. Not about enemies, no, not about those who coveted the throne. They whispered about him, about Ferdinand, about his weariness, his cold calculation, that he was tired of her failures, of the fruitless waiting, that he needed a clean slate, a new bride, whose womb would carry the promise of an heir, not just the bitter echo of unfulfilled hopes. And these whispers were not empty sound. Just a few days after the Queen's body was lowered into the crypt, a new chilling rumour swept through the palace. The court apothecary, found dead, in his own chambers. His desk was cluttered with vials, the air thick with the smell of herbs and something else, something acrid, like fear. On a blood-stained piece of parchment lying next to his lifeless hand, uneven, hasty lines were visible. A letter. But before anyone could read it, Ferdinand's agents emerged from the shadows. Their steps were silent, their hands were swift, the parchment vanished as if it had never been. Only vague conjectures remained, hanging in the air, mingling with the smell of dust and old secrets. Some whispered of poisons, of confessions torn from a deathbed delirium, others of a truth revealed, of Ferdinand's own medical condition, of the unbearable demands he made on his wives, and that Maria Antonia was but one of the victims of his secret. Ferdinand's own behavior after Maria Antonia's death spoke more eloquently than any words. Publicly, he was the embodiment of grief. His face, pale and stern, appeared at all the funeral ceremonies. His voice sounded hollow as he spoke words of farewell. Mournful marches played, and the heavy velvet of the draperies absorbed the light. But behind the closed doors of his private apartments, where the air was thick with the unsaid, he dropped the mask. An almost imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders, a faint, barely audible sigh of relief. Not even a few weeks had passed before his secretaries were frantically compiling lists, names, genealogies. Ferdinand's gaze swept over them, lingering on only one decisive point: proven fertility, women who had already given birth, women whose wombs had already known the triumph of procreation. Meanwhile, in the secret laboratories of the palace, where the air was thick with the acrid smell of alcohol and something more unsettling, the king's physicians worked feverishly. Their faces were covered in sweat, their eyes held a frantic, hunted gleam. If Ferdinand was to marry again, successfully, without a repeat of past tragedies, they needed to find a solution, any solution. They hunched over anatomical atlases, their fingers sliding over cold instruments. Whispers gave way to sharp commands, the clinking of glass, the scratching of quills on parchment. Marital aids, ever more sophisticated. surgical techniques capable of altering anatomy itself. The strangest experiments in royal history unfolded in the dim candlelight, like a nightmare come to life. Desperate attempts to spare future wives, the trauma Maria Antonia had already endured. By the time the shadow of a second marriage began to loom over Ferdinand, his character had already been carved from a different, darker stone. The trauma of his first marriage, like a deep, unhealing wound, had twisted him, making his soul cold and callous. Deep-seated complexes about his body, his affliction, merged with it, creating a man encased in a shell of alienation, a man incapable of genuine human connection, of empathy. His gaze, once merely stern, now seemed glassy, reflecting only his own fears and calculations, not the living emotions of those around him. In his presence, the air grew heavy, and voices became hushed. He had become the harbinger of that dark, hated figure destined to go down in history. The world, for Ferdinand, was just a mechanism, a huge complex clockwork, where every gear, every spring existed for only one purpose, his own. He saw faces, yes, but behind them were no souls, only functions. His first wife, a fragile, delicate part, had failed to fit, had failed to turn as he wished. He felt no pang, only a cold, detached assessment of a broken piece. A quiet, almost inaudible click as he disconnected her, consigning her to the scrap heap. His people, those whispering masses, were just the gears that made his grand machine of power grind, feeding his insatiable ego. And those who dared to resist? A sudden, sharp screech of metal on metal, a splinter in the flawless mechanism. They were not people, but obstacles. Obstacles that had to be crushed, silenced. A new game began to unfold in the hushed corridors of the palace. A game of testing boundaries. Ferdinand's voice, once merely regal, now carried a sharper edge. A cold, almost imperceptible tremor that ran down the spine. His orders, at first merely capricious, hardened, becoming brittle, and then outright cruel. A servant who caught a glimpse of his nudity through a half-open door might hear a sharp, sudden intake of breath, and then nothing, only the echo of silence after his disappearance. No goodbyes, no whispers of dismissal, just an empty space where a man had been, vanished. The very air seemed to thicken with unspoken terror. The guards, sworn to keep the deepest secrets of the royal chambers, now looked at maps, tracing the dreary lines to the crumbling fringes of the empire. The biting wind on distant, forgotten outposts, the dust of decaying fortresses. This was their new reality. A slow, chilling exile, far from the gilded cages of the court. And then the whispers began. He heard them everywhere, a low, insidious hum that seemed to follow him through every echoing hall, a sudden, suppressed cough behind a tapestry. A too quick exchange of glances. They were laughing. At him. He felt their gazes on his back, a prickling sensation, even when no one was there. It was not pure delusion, the court was whispering, their hushed tones dissecting his failures, his strange habits. But his perception distorted it, magnifying it into a monstrous, mocking chorus. His breath would catch, a cold, hard knot of rage tightened in his gut. He began to keep lists, names scrawled in the flickering candlelight, each stroke of the pen a promise. He meticulously planned scenarios, intricate webs of humiliation and retribution, a chilling, almost artistic pleasure in anticipating the moment, the look in their eyes when his power would finally be absolute and his revenge, sweet and precise, would fall. By 1807, the palace felt different, a palpable tension. The air vibrated with unspoken designs. Ferdinand, the prince, found himself at the cold, hard center of a new web. Not his own, not yet, a conspiracy. The rustle of silk, the quiet clink of a hidden dagger, the muffled voices of Spain's most influential nobles, its seasoned military officers. They saw him as the key, a weapon, a means to overthrow the crumbling rule of Charles IV, to silence the irritating voice of Godoy, the hated minister. They saw weakness in the king and a glimmer of strength, a promise in the prince. They did not see the true rot. They could not fathom the chilling truth that the man they sought to elevate, whose own body had betrayed him, had forged from that betrayal a mind far more dangerous than the incompetence they yearned to replace. A slow, creeping poison, ready to consume everything. They called themselves the Fernandinos, a name spoken in whispers with a mixture of reverence and desperate hope. They created an image, polished it to a high shine. Ferdinand, the desired. They wove tales of his sharp intellect, his fervent patriotism, his vision for a reborn Spain, rising from the ashes of its former glory. The words spread like wildfire, carried on the wind, echoing in taverns and grand halls. A promise, but beneath the shimmering veneer of their propaganda, a deeper, colder truth festered, a truth they desperately tried to bury. A growing unease that tightened their throats, made their hands tremble. The prince's eyes at times were frighteningly empty. His temper, a sudden explosive crack. His cruelty, a silent shadow that grew longer with each passing day. They saw it, they felt it, and they concealed it. For their own ambitions, they chose to ignore the gathering storm within the man they had chosen as their leader. A cold October wind, not from the biting air, but from the tight knot that cinched his stomach. A shiver ran through him. The whispers, at first faint, then louder, sharper, thickened until they turned into accusations. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the rustle of robes, the distant clink of a chain. His breath caught. They knew. His plan, his ambitions, laid bare, exposed. A tremor ran through his body. Not for them, no, for himself. A coldness on his skin, a sudden paralyzing fear of his father's wrath, of Napoleon's distant, calculating gaze. Loyalty? A word, empty and meaningless, against the crushing weight of his own survival. The quill felt alien in his trembling fingers. The black ink, like spilled blood, bloomed on the parchment. Every name he wrote was a betrayal. Every detail he confessed, a nail driven into their coffins, but not his. His voice, thin, a reedy plea, begged for forgiveness from the very parents he had sought to overthrow. The air in the chamber, heavy with the smell of fear and old wax. He could almost hear the distant clang of prison gates, the creak of carriage wheels carrying them into exile. They had risked everything for him, and he had thrown them, without a second thought, under the wheels of his own survival, a model forged in that moment, use, discard, a cold, unyielding logic that would define his every reign, his every breath. But even as the shadows of his political games lengthened, another, more intimate horror was unfolding within him. A personal torment, his body, a traitor. The whispers of the court physicians, hushed and concerned, grew louder in his own mind. The constant, grotesque growth, the changing shape, each month a new, alarming alteration. The cool, probing touch of their instruments, the faint smell of antiseptics and fear. Intimacy had become a jagged, impossible landscape, a rare, cruel freak of nature, they whispered. Megalorethra, a monstrous, unceasing growth that had turned his own flesh against him, against the very purpose of a king. Their explanation mattered little. The brutal, stark truth was this: an heir. For that, he would need more than just a woman. He would need complex apparatus, crafted with a perverse ingenuity, and wives. Not partners. No, wives, submitted to his will, their spirits broken, their bodies forced to comply. The chilling realization settled in his chest like a block of ice. His future marriages, not unions of state, but cold, calculated acts of coercion. Women chosen not for beauty or lineage, but for their pliability, their vulnerability, instruments to be manipulated, forced, to bear the weight of his monstrous secret and his desperate need. Deep in the stone heart of the palace, away from the sun's rays, the royal workshops hummed with a different kind of activity. No longer crafting jewelry or ornate furniture. Now they were a macabre fusion, a medical laboratory, a chamber of perverse invention. The air thick with the scent of fine oils, polished wood, and something metallic, something cold. Here, skilled hands, once deft with delicate filigree, now shaped grotesque contraptions. Adjustable pillows, restraining devices, intricate supports designed to facilitate the impossible, to minimize the damage to fragile flesh. Every hammer blow, every precise measurement, a secret, a terrible, unspoken secret. These craftsmen, bound by an oath of absolute silence, worked under the double-edged sword of Ferdinand's royal patronage. Generous payments, yes, but also the chilling weight of his threats, unspoken but palpable in the dim light. A sudden, sharp coldness, the disappearance of a colleague, then another. Whispers, like dry leaves rustling on cold stone, began to spread. Unexplained deaths. A brutal, final silence, the king, ensuring his secrets would remain buried as deeply as the bodies of those who knew too much. The true nature of their grim creations, swallowed by the insatiable maw of the palace, the invasion of 1808. Not the roar of cannons, not the screams of soldiers, just the cold, alien gaze of Napoleon. It burned through him, right to the bone. The throne, it just vanished, as if it had never been. One moment it was beneath him, solid, carved oak. The next, an emptiness, a piercing cold. And the humiliation, not just being stripped of his crown, but the knowledge in Bonaparte's eyes that he knew about him, about the shameful secret that burned inside him like poison. The French dossiers. He imagined them, the rustle of pages, the dry, merciless facts, and among them, his own body, laid out, floor by floor, his curse, now exposed before his enemy. Cold sweat trickled down his back, even when the room was stuffy. 6 long years. Valencay. The breath of the castle, stale stone, the smell of damp, and the doctors. Their steps in the corridors, a measured, inexorable rhythm. Every time the door opened, his heart clenched into an icy knot. French doctors. Their curiosity, not compassion, but a greedy, cold interest. No ceremony, no bows, just firm, confident hands, the cold metal of instruments on his skin. The rustle of sheets, their low, guttural whispers, words he didn't fully understand, but he felt their weight, anomaly, case, study. Hours stretched into an eternity. Each examination, not just pain, it was an invasion, deep, unceremonious, a slow, humiliating torture. He was not a king, he was a specimen, an object. Under their gazes, under their fingers, he felt sticky, dirty, disgusting. He saw their faces, the doctors, their eyes widened as they looked, a barely suppressed gasp, or a sharp, nervous exhale, and then, for the 1000th time, he saw himself through their eyes, a monster, a mythological creature, trapped in a human shell. He felt its weight, its ugliness, every step, every turn, every moment, a reminder, the perfect storm. The words spoken by one of them echoed in his head, as if he were not a man but a natural disaster, a confluence of curses in one flesh. And this thought, cold, detached, of how his own body had betrayed him, had become his prison. And in the midst of it all, the letters, crumpled, secret, smelling of earth and hope, whispers of war, of nobles, of generals who were dying, for him, for his throne. Men with faces scorched by the wind, with hands worn to the bone, were dying in filthy trenches. Their blood soaked the Spanish soil to bring him back. Him, and he clutched a quill in his palm, feeling its light, almost weightless heaviness, and the only thought burning in his brain, pushing everything else aside. How to deal with this shame, how to find a way out of this fleshly trap, how to produce an heir so the cursed line would not be broken. A bitter laugh stuck in his throat, their sacrifice, his obsession. The chasm between them was bottomless, the years of exile. Every day, the scratch of a quill on parchment, the smell of ink, the dim candlelight on the table, casting bizarre shadows. He wrote letters, long agonizing, to the monarchs of Europe. Every word, a plea, carefully veiled. The search for a bride, one who would agree to his special circumstances. He spent more time on those words than on anything else, choosing them like precious stones to hide the ugliness. The world was on fire. Spain was bleeding. He heard snippets of news. Cities were falling. People were dying of hunger, of bullets. But those sounds were distant, muffled. His world had shrunk to the size of this room, to this scrap of paper, to the burning shame and desperate hope. Spain was ablaze, and he was planning his next wedding night. Clutching the quill, his mind filled only with the image of another's bed, full of fear and the anticipation of new humiliation. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds that greeted him were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. A roaring wave of sound rolled in, overwhelming, deafening. They threw flowers. Petals gently touched the dusty cobblestones, settled on the heavy carriage wheels. They wept for joy, tears glistening on their faces, mingling with sweat. They fell to their knees, their bodies shaking in reverent ecstasy as the royal carriage passed. Children, born in the roar of war, looked up for the first time at the king for whose return their parents had given their lives. It seemed the very stones of Madrid vibrated, humming with jubilation, echoing every cry, every breath. Ferdinand smiled. The smile was frozen on his lips, barely touching his eyes. He waved mechanically from the carriage window, feeling the fabric of his glove rub against his palm, his arm aching from the strain. But his thoughts, heavy and obsessive, had long since drifted from this noise, from this blinding light. They were focused on more intimate concerns. His first sole priority was not to govern a ravaged Spain, not to reward those who had shed blood for his throne. No, it was to find a new wife, one who could finally give him an heir. The one who had so agonizingly, so humiliatingly eluded him all these years. The king's return marked the beginning of what historians would later call the ominous decade. But the true ominousness, the kind that chilled to the bone, lay not only in Ferdinand's political tyranny, which pressed down on the country like a heavy, sticky blanket. It was in his own increasingly desperate, increasingly bizarre attempts to fulfill his royal duty, to produce offspring. His personal, agonizing dysfunction became inextricably linked with the dysfunction of the entire state, creating a ruler whose deepest flaws manifested as a national catastrophe, like a festering wound, poisoning everything around it. Ferdinand's very first act, as soon as he felt the solid ground of the palace beneath his feet again, was to commission a completely new set of marital aids, the best craftsmen in Europe. He sent his agents to Germany, to Italy, even to the distant, spice-scented and mysterious Ottoman Empire. They sought artisans whose hands were capable of creating devices for delicate royal circumstances. The resulting collection, carefully hidden in the secret rooms of the palace where the air was heavy with dust and stale secrecy, represented the pinnacle of perverse ingenuity: cold metal, smooth wood, intricate mechanisms, everything that the sick genius of the early 19th century could produce. Ferdinand chose Maria Isabella of Portugal as his second wife, another cousin, another turn in the endless, suffocating cycle of royal inbreeding that had cursed his bloodline like a heavy, invisible stone. She was 19 when she arrived at the Spanish court in 1816. Her eyes shone with naive hope, that fragile, almost painful hope that young princesses brought to these marriages of convenience, like a precious but doomed gift. The court physicians had already informed her ladies-in-waiting, their voices low, almost whispering, about the special preparations that would be required for the wedding night. But nothing, not a single whisper, not a single vague hint, could have prepared Isabella for the chilling reality of what awaited her behind those palace walls, in those secret, dusty rooms. The royal wedding was a bright, dazzling spectacle, designed to hide a desperate, gnawing fear. Ferdinand stood at the altar, feeling the weight of the gold brocade on his shoulders, its pile tickling his skin. The sun's rays, filtering through the stained glass windows, fell on the stone floor, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air, but his chest tightened with anxiety. He heard the hum of voices, low, almost reverent, and the distant ringing of bells, but all sounds were drowned out by the noise of blood pulsing in his temples. His face was a mask, behind which were hidden sleepless nights and feverish thoughts. Shadows flashed in his memory, the whisper of doctors, the pungent smell of alchemical potions, the acrid smoke of strange herbs burning in copper bowls, and finally, the oily alien scent of the clothes of the one who was brought under the cover of the deepest darkness through the wet, earth-smelling streets of Madrid, promising deliverance from his royal difficulties. The cold night wind had chilled him to the bone then, and the fear was sticky and repulsive. The wedding night, it hung over them like a black cloud, a harbinger of the storm that was to haunt them to the very end. A heavy silence pressed on the walls of the royal bedchamber, where only the flickering flame of candles cast bizarre shadows. The air was thick with the scent of incense, mixed with the smell of sweat and rising desperation. Ferdinand felt cold sweat trickle down his back, his hands tremble, and his breath become ragged and hoarse. All the preparations, all the contraptions, all the endless consultations with the best minds in Europe, it all turned out to be empty noise. The monster living in his body proved invincible. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp, tearing scream, not a moan of passion, but a cry of genuine horror and pain that cut through the air and echoed through the dark, empty corridors of the palace. It was followed by the scrape of wood on stone, a dull thud, the crack of breaking furniture. In the morning, servants, frozen with fear, found blood-stained sheets crumpled into a ball, and the wreckage of chairs, evidence of a union that resembled medieval torture more than a monarchical alliance. The air in the chambers was still heavy, with a taste of metal and terror. Isabella never recovered. Her voice became fragile, her words often stumbling, breaking mid-sentence, as if an invisible hand were squeezing her throat. Courtiers noted how her shoulders would jerk sharply, how her breath would catch whenever the heavy oak doors of her chambers creaked open, letting in Ferdinand's shadow. A cold shiver ran down her skin, her eyes widened, filling with unspoken fear. The palace doctors called it hysterical fits, but her ladies-in-waiting saw something else: convulsions, involuntary twitches, and those piercing screams that tore through the night silence. She would wake up in a cold sweat, screaming about the monster that haunted her dreams, its shadow casting a ghostly chill on the walls of her room. Isabella's voice, distorted with horror, rang in the night silence, making even the most stoic courtiers shudder. Ferdinand, broken and humiliated, interpreted her horror as a personal insult, a slap to his royal dignity. A hot flush of anger and shame burned his face, clenching his jaws. His paranoia, already legendary, reached unimaginable heights. Every rustle, every glance, every whisper behind his back seemed to him part of a conspiracy. He was convinced that Isabella had colluded with foreign powers to make a laughingstock of him. His days turned into an endless hunt for ghosts. He himself unsealed her letters, hearing the dry rustle of parchment and the snap of breaking wax, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume, searching for hidden messages. He had her food checked, ordering servants to taste every bite, listening to their swallows, imagining the bitter taste of poison on his own tongue. His hands methodically, coldly searched her chambers, sliding over silk fabrics, probing for hiding places, listening in the silence for proof of betrayal that could confirm his madness. The king's sexual impotence metastasized into a political psychosis, corroding every aspect of his rule like a poison. The pressure, it became suffocating, unbearable, consuming both the royal couple and the entire court like a bottomless swamp. The need to produce an heir turned into a morbid obsession. The royal bedchamber, once a place of intimacy, became a cold, soulless laboratory. Ferdinand commissioned increasingly bizarre consultations. Ghastly, pale-faced phrenologists with their sharp, clinking instruments, anatomists with cold, impassive gazes, and even circus performers who smelled of sawdust and sweat, claiming special expertise in unusual anatomical problems, flocked there. The air in the room was heavy, saturated with the smell of alcohol, strange ointments, and something vaguely metallic. Muffled commands, strained breathing, low, guttural moans of effort, followed by suppressed sobs, could be heard. Cold, unfamiliar hands touched the body, causing a burning shame. Human dignity melted away, evaporating in this atmosphere of desperation and humiliation, leaving only naked, trembling flesh and emptiness. In the depths of yellowed pages, saturated with the smell of musty dust and old ink, a court physician left his most disturbing report. He wrote of Ferdinand, of a king whose bedroom had become an anatomical theatre, lit by the flickering flame of candles. German anatomists, their glasses glinting in the semi-darkness. French doctors, their quills scratching on parchment. They stood by the bed like birds of prey, their gazes sharp scalpels dissecting the last veil of royal intimacy. Every rustle of the sheets, every convulsive breath of Ferdinand, every clumsy gesture, All was recorded, detailed notes, precise sketches. His shame became a subject of study, spreading like a contagious disease through the medical schools of Europe. A shame that was now whispered in university lecture halls, dissected, turning the king's flesh and blood into abstract diagrams. Isabella. She was there, subjected to this parade of curious gazes, cold hands, impassive voices. Every day her soul shriveled like a dried leaf. Her body began to speak for her, refusal of food. The utensils on the table remained untouched, the silver tarnished. Her weight melted away, leaving the sharp angles of bones under the thin fabric of dresses that now hung on her like a hanger. But the most terrifying thing was her gaze, empty, absent. There was no longer the fire of anger in it, only a bottomless abyss, looking into which servants would turn away, seized by an icy horror. The young queen, once full of life, was now just a pale shadow, a living ghost. Her footsteps, barely audible, echoed in the endless halls of the palace, which had turned from a golden cage into a real stone prison. But the king's personal tragedy could not remain merely personal. It seeped through the thick palace walls like a poisonous gas. The echo of rebellions from across the ocean, from the American colonies, grew louder. There, far away, Ferdinand was not just a king. He was a symbol. And his inability to produce an heir, it was whispered and then shouted, was a sign of a divine curse, the seal of wrath on the Bourbon reign. Revolutionary pamphlets, smelling of fresh printer's ink, multiplied like weeds, depicting him as an impotent tyrant whose physical weakness was a reflection of his political nullity. The king's intimate shame, his secret torment, became a weapon, a battle cry that spread from the sweltering lands of Mexico to the icy peaks of Argentina. Every whisper, every taunt, every pamphlet, it was a blow struck at his throne. Ferdinand's reaction was predictable. Paranoia, like a poisonous ivy, entwined his mind. Cruelty became his answer. He unleashed a new wave of purges. Anyone who dared to whisper about his condition, anyone who even in thought supported the freedom of the colonies, became a target. The Inquisition, his personal instrument of retribution, which he had brought back from oblivion, now investigated cases of sexual slander against the crown. The air grew thick. Every breath, every word, even spoken in the semi-darkness of one's own bedroom between husband and wife, could turn into a denunciation, could lead to a knock on the door in the middle of the night, to the cold of prison stones, to a silent, final death. Fear became ubiquitous, sticky, suffocating. The king's obsession with secrecy pierced every stone of the palace like a cold draught. It seemed he heard whispers even in the silence, saw shadows where there were none. He ordered secret passages to be built, narrow and damp, where the only sound was his own footsteps, muffled and cautious, as he glided between his chambers and Isabella's, invisible to the servants. Mirrors, placed at impossible angles, caught every glint of light, every nervous gesture, turning the halls into a trap for the eyes. And everywhere, in the dustiest corners, in the most luxurious boudoir, unseen rumors flowed, followed by his spies like spiders, greedily catching every scrap of conversation about the marriage. Meanwhile, in Queen Isabella's chambers, the air grew heavier, saturated with pain. Her body, like a fragile vessel, slowly withered under the onslaught of his touches, rough and merciless, and his silent but all-pervasive psychological terror. The doctors, their faces pale and concerned, whispered of false pregnancies. periods when her exhausted body, as if by a cruel irony, mimicked life. Her belly would round slightly, her breasts would swell, and in her husband Ferdinand's eyes, a spark of hope, almost mad, hungry, would ignite. He saw in these phantom signs salvation, an heir. But each time, after weeks, the agony of waiting was replaced by an icy emptiness, when the truth, cold and merciless, crashed down on him, leaving only the ashes of disappointment. These false pregnancies became a bitter, almost cynical spectacle at a court already drowning in dysfunction. Servants, leaning towards each other, whispered about the king pacing back and forth outside Isabella's doors, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridors, now praying, now cursing, his voice breaking into an incoherent whisper, then a furious roar. It seemed he believed that divine will itself could overcome the mechanical impossibility of his situation, break the bonds of the curse. When each false hope inevitably shattered, Ferdinand would sink into a black, viscous depression that, like a suffocating fog, paralyzed the entire government for weeks. The silence in his chambers became deafening, only sometimes pierced by the dull thud of his fist against the wall. In 1818, after 2 years of this nightmarish marriage, Isabella finally found her freedom. It came to her in the only way available to royal women of her era when all other doors were locked, through death. Her tormented and battered body gave up, and the court physicians, bowing their heads, diplomatically pronounced the diagnosis, nervous exhaustion. But in the private letters written by the trembling hands of the palace staff, a different, darker truth shone through. It was whispered that she herself had hastened her end, using subtle, almost invisible forms of self-harm. Her last words, spoken barely audibly to her confessor, were not a plea, but a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for the approaching release, for the end of the agony. Her last breath escaped her lips, light as a feather, and peace finally enveloped her. Ferdinand's reaction to Isabella's death was not grief, but a horrifying manifestation of his complete psychological breakdown. He did not mourn her, did not seek comfort. Instead, a mad fire lit up in his eyes, and he convinced himself that she had been murdered by enemies, villains seeking to prevent him from producing an heir. His orders rang through the air, sharp, imperious. Several doctors were forced to perform an autopsy, their instruments clattering in the dead silence as he greedily searched for evidence of poison, traces of a conspiracy. Several of Isabella's ladies-in-waiting, their faces pale with terror, were arrested on suspicion of treason, their screams echoing through the corridors. The king's grief was indistinguishable from his paranoia. They intertwined into a single suffocating knot, creating a feedback loop of rage and suspicion that consumed everyone around, pulling the court into a vortex of fear. The funeral of Queen Isabella. It turned into a spectacle that made the blood run cold, a sight that horrified even King Ferdinand's most devoted supporters. He himself, the king, insisted on examining the body again and again as it was being prepared for its final journey. His icy gaze swept over the lifeless face, the darkened skin. He touched the cold hands, his fingers feeling the waxy density of the skin, and each time a shiver ran down the spines of the onlookers. Ferdinand muttered, low, almost guttural, about the wasted potential of her womb. And these words seemed to hang in the air, thick as the smell of death. The death mask. He ordered it to be made, her cold, lifeless likeness. He displayed it in his private chambers, where the air was heavy with dust and stale sorrow. Visitors who dared to enter told of seeing him, bent over this silent face, his voice, almost a whisper, breaking the silence, carrying on strange, one-sided conversations with the lifeless clay. But the search for an heir could not be postponed. Neither grief nor the king's madness could stop this ruthless political mechanism. Just a few months after the earth had received Isabella's body, the air was already filled with the rustle of papers, the scratching of quills, and the quiet, insistent voices of advisers negotiating for a third wife. The task seemed impossible. To find a European princess desperate or blind enough to marry a king whose previous wives had met such a grim, inexplicable end. Rumours of his peculiarities had already become legends, spread by whispers throughout all the courts of the continent. The negotiations proved more difficult than anyone could have anticipated. Every letter that arrived from distant lands carried echoes of fear. Several potential brides, upon hearing of Ferdinand's identity, withdrew their candidacies, their decisions made after private, tense consultations with doctors who had served at the Spanish court. These physicians returned with pale faces, their voices hollow with unspoken horror. Other princesses, braver or more needy, demanded unprecedented concessions, separate chambers, the right to their own numerous guards, as if what awaited them in Madrid was not a marital bed, but a dungeon. Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction, now openly whispered about, had become not just a personal problem, but a genuine diplomatic burden, a heavy weight that threatened to isolate Spain from any potential allies, leaving it in a cold, ringing void. And yet, in the end, the king's agents found her, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a princess whose family's desperate financial situation forced them to turn a blind eye, to deafen their ears to Ferdinand's notorious reputation. She was 24 when she arrived in Madrid in 1819. Older, more experienced than Isabella, but in her eyes, in every movement, there was the same doomed hope, the same fragile belief in a better future that had once characterized the arrival of her predecessors. The cold wind of Madrid greeted her, carrying with it the smells of dust and old stones, smells that seemed saturated with past failures. The third wedding. It was more modest than the previous ones, as if the very air around it was saturated with weariness. This reflected both Ferdinand's advanced age and the deep, almost physical fatigue of the court from the endless royal matrimonial disasters. There were fewer foreign dignitaries, their faces expressing polite boredom rather than joy. The celebrations were less lavish. The music sounded muffled, as if from behind a thick curtain. In every corner, in every glance, in every sigh, there was a palpable sense that everyone present was simply performing a ritual, an empty, lifeless ritual that had already failed twice, leaving behind only the bitter taste of disappointment and a premonition of the inevitable end. Maria Josepha was far better prepared for her ordeal than Isabella had been. The Saxon doctors, after thorough consultation with their Spanish colleagues, had given her detailed instructions. She brought with her her own collection of medical devices, smooth, cold metal instruments gleaming in the light, vials of clear and cloudy liquids that emitted a faint herbal scent, powders wrapped in thin paper. Along with her came her personal physician, a specialist in complex marital situations, his gaze calm but with a deep, almost clinical detachment. Her approach to marriage was far from romantic. It was a task, a medical task. Her royal duties were not lavish balls and tender words, but a diagnosis to be made, and a problem to be solved with strict scientific methodology. A cold, hard lump of determination solidified in her chest, silencing any hint of fear or despair. The air in the royal chambers was cold, almost sterile, not like Isabella's, where laughter or desperate sobs were sometimes heard. Here, there was only the rustle of starched sheets, the muffled whisper of servants, and then silence, a silence heavy with expectation, or perhaps with premonition. For Maria Josefa, it was a task, a problem requiring a solution. Her quill, sharp and precise, glided across the crisp parchment. Date, time, method, result. Each stroke was a measured beat in the rhythm of infertility. Not the gentle sigh of lovers, but the dry rustle of a turned page, the barely audible scratch of a quill recording the cold, undeniable facts of a body that refused to obey. Her gaze was so even, devoid of all warmth. Not the frightened, recoiling look of Isabella, but something colder, sharper, a gaze that dissected. Ferdinand felt it on his skin, a chill that ran deeper than any draught. Was he a man to her, or just a specimen? A medical curiosity displayed under her cool, appraising eyes. The thought, a tiny seed, began to sprout. A curiosity. The whispers began. First in his own mind, then brought to him by his most trusted, most feared spies. Letters, so many letters, to Saxony, to foreign doctors. What secrets did they contain? His secrets, his anatomy, the very word felt like a violation. He saw the flicker of a candle on the sealed envelopes, imagined his most intimate failures being laid out, dissected, for all the courts of Europe to read, to laugh at, a slow, burning shame. While the royal bedchamber hummed with its sterile routine, beyond its walls, a great empire groaned, a slow, agonizing collapse. The distant roar of cannons from across the ocean, muffled by the thick palace walls, but growing louder in the minds of the ministers. One by one, the jewels of the crown, the American colonies, were slipping away. The tide of gold that had flowed for 3 centuries was receding, leaving only the dry, cracked earth of a depleted treasury. But the king was far away. His mind, a tangled knot of humiliation and desperate hope, clung to the single, all-consuming problem. The kingdom could bleed, it could starve, it could fall apart, but the council meetings waited, postponed. A whisper, a sigh, a minister's jaw clenched in frustration. Weeks turned into months. The fate of millions hung in the balance, while the king, behind closed doors, consulted, whispered, with doctors about new, desperate methods, about unthinkable contraptions. The initial roar of welcome, the joyous ringing of bells that had greeted his return, had long since faded. Now it was replaced by a deeper sound, a growl, the growl of empty stomachs, a low hum of discontent in the cramped city streets, a hum that soon grew into the deafening roar of revolution. Beyond the city walls, the silence of the countryside was broken only by the sharp, metallic clatter of banditry. While his people starved, their bones sharp beneath their rags, the royal treasury was being emptied. Not for bread, not for peace, but for whispered consultations, for strange, cold contraptions, for the fleeting, desperate hope of a son. The whispers, once confined to the palace, now spread on the wind, crossing borders, turning into a cruel, mocking laughter in the courts of Europe. Spain, once mighty, was now a laughingstock. Its decline, its utter humiliation, was mirrored in the most personal, most agonizing, most public failure of its king. 10 years. 10 years of fruitless waiting that pressed on the palace walls like a heavy, invisible stone. The silence of Maria Josefa's bedchamber was not just an absence of sound, but a deep, piercing emptiness, an echo of unfulfilled hopes. And then, in 1829, that silence suddenly broke, not with a thunderclap, no, with a soft, almost inaudible whisper that, like a spark, ran through the stone corridors, through the heavy tapestries, through the tightly closed doors, until it grew into a hum that filled every corner of the court, and then all of Europe. Maria Josepha was pregnant. The impossible had happened. Diplomatic correspondents, like a flock of hungry birds, circled over Madrid, their quills scratched on paper, spreading conjectures around the world, whispers of divine intervention, the dry cough of skeptics about the achievements of unknown medicine, and the acrid, sticky whisper of cynics about betrayal, about foreign blood in the veins of the future heir. The air rang with tension, with hidden glances, with unspoken questions hanging in every hall, in every gallery where the shadows of courtiers glided. For Ferdinand, this news was a flash of madness, euphoria, so searing it burned, mixed with an icy terror. He paced his chambers, his steps beating a nervous rhythm on the marble floor. From every corner, he imagined the shadows of enemies. The heavy thud of new guards' boots echoed in the deserted corridors, their shadows, huge and threatening, falling on the walls. The best physicians in Europe, their faces gaunt from the long journey, their bags tightly packed with instruments and potions, hurriedly arrived at the palace, their steps sounding hurried, almost panicked. The Queen's rooms filled with the thick scent of incense, a haze that floated from the censers swung by the clergy of Madrid. The monotonous chanting of prayers, low and deep, was meant to ward off invisible forces, to protect this fragile, precious fruit from the curses and scientific sorcery that, the king believed, were already extending their invisible tentacles toward it. 7 months passed under this sticky veil of anxiety. The days dragged on. Every breath of the Queen, every step she took, echoed with a dull thud in the hearts of the courtiers. But in the 7th month, something changed. A new, alarming smell hung in the air, the smell of sickness, mixed with the smell of helplessness. Muffled groans began to come from Maria Josepha's chambers, then indistinct cries that cut through the silence of the night. The doctors, their faces pale, their voices clipped, did not understand what was happening. They whispered of a misfortune, of an unknown malady, while modern thought would have called it a placental abruption, a condition that could have been managed. But Ferdinand's interference, his mad belief in the supernatural, his insistent demands that mystics and alchemists, their eyes burning with a feverish gleam, their hands trembling over strange flasks, bustle alongside the trained physicians, turned the Queen's chambers into a chaotic vortex. The clinking of glass vials, the sharp smell of herbs, the smoke from burning incense, mingled with the smell of sweat and fear. Effective intervention became impossible. On May 18, 1829, a scream pierced the palace. A premature birth. Everyone who was near would forever remember the horror. The walls trembled with pain, with inhuman effort. Ferdinand, his face frozen in a waxen mask, his eyes gleaming with a wild, unhealthy light, stood there, not looking away, watching every agonizing movement, having not the slightest understanding of medicine. The creak of the bed, the sloshing of water, the sharp metallic smell of blood, mixed with the smell of fear, filled the room. Finally, a faint, barely audible cry. A girl, barely alive. Her tiny blue body trembled in the midwife's hands. Only a few hours. The breath, thin as a spider's thread, broke. Silence. A deafening silence. Maria Josepha survived, but her strength was gone, like sand through her fingers. 3 weeks later, her last breath, light, almost inaudible, faded into the air. The doctors called it puerperal fever. But it was a combination of a slow-killing infection and the bottomless despair that squeezed her heart until it stopped. The double tragedy broke Ferdinand's mind. The palace walls seemed to close in around him. He flatly refused to allow the bodies to be buried, neither the mother nor the child. The palace filled with a smell, at first barely perceptible, then increasingly sharp, suffocating, a sweetish, putrid smell of decomposition that penetrated every crack, settled on the tapestries, seeped into the skin. For almost a week, this stench hung in the air, mingling with the smell of panic and despair. The king, his eyes gleaming madly, his voice hoarse, demanded the impossible. He forced the court physicians to continue their attempts, ever stranger, ever more insane, to revive both mother and child. The scraping of instruments, the rustle of sheets, the muffled groans of the doctors, their faces covered in a cold sweat as they performed meaningless rites over the dead. Ferdinand was in denial, denying the reality of his losses, clinging to the last, insane hopes of resurrection. The palace became a tomb, where the living wandered among the dead, and the air was saturated with the unbearable smell of death and a shattered mind. When Ferdinand finally gave in, when that cold, sticky weight settled in his chest, becoming part of the air he breathed, only then did he collapse into an abyss so deep that even the courtiers, accustomed to the whisper of death, trembled. He stopped eating. His stomach cramped, but there was no hunger, only the acrid taste of ash on his tongue. He refused to see his advisers. Their voices seemed a distant, meaningless drone, their faces blurry smudges in the dim light. The days merged into a monotonous, agonizing torture. He spent them looking at the masks, 3 white, lifeless forms, molded from a final breath. The cold wax slid under his fingers as he carefully touched their features. The eyes were empty, but Ferdinand saw in them a reflection of his own soul, devastated, tormented. The damp, musty smell of his chambers mingled with the acrid scent of wax, creating a suffocating mixture of despair. He became a living ghost. His footsteps on the marble floors of the palace echoed hollowly, like a funeral bell. Spain was crumbling around him, but the roar was distant, muffled by the internal chaos. But fate must have been laughing. In 1829, when he was 45, when every morning brought only fatigue and the bitter realization of his infertility, it dealt the final, most cruel blow. Decades of searching for an heir, decades of humiliating attempts, and suddenly, a 4th marriage. The advisers, their faces tense, their voices trembling with desperation, presented her name, Maria Christina of Naples. In their eyes, Ferdinand saw not hope, but a cold, calculating gleam. They spoke of stability, of a kingdom cracking at the seams, but they remained silent about the main thing. He learned of it only when everything was decided, when there was no turning back. She arrived in Madrid, and in her appearance, another secret was already hidden. The 4th wedding. A farce. The air in the cathedral was heavy, stuffy, saturated with the scent of incense and hypocrisy. Every rustle of silk, every whisper from the crowd seemed deafening. His gaze swept over her figure as she walked to the altar, and his heart stopped, then began to beat with a frantic speed. She was noticeably pregnant, clearly, a child that could not possibly be his. A hot flush of shame burned his face, but Ferdinand forced himself to smile. Desperation, that searing, corrosive feeling, was stronger than pride. "This is Providence," he whispered to himself. Divine Providence had answered his prayers, albeit in such a strange, such a humiliating way. He clung to that thought, like a drowning man to a straw. The birth of Isabella II in 1830, her first cry. It should have been a triumph, the culmination of his search, but instead it became the beginning of a new, even more sophisticated torture. He knew. Every cell in his body screamed that this child was not his flesh and blood, but he had to maintain the fiction, to hold it like a fragile, transparent sphere, so that the dynasty would not crumble to dust. His relationship with Maria Christina turned into an elaborate dance of lies. She pretended to respect him, her smile empty, her touches cold, and he pretended to believe that her child was his, every day, every hour, every glance. It was a lie, heavy as lead and bitter as poison. The final years, they were marked by the same agonizing, humiliating dysfunction that had plagued him his entire adult life. But now, a burden was added. The burden of maintaining a fraudulent succession. Night after night, he continued his desperate attempts at intimacy with Maria Christina. He clung to the hope, to a tiny, flickering spark. What if another child, who would be his, of his own blood, the same doctors, the same specialists who had witnessed his previous failures, now stood at the bedroom door. Their gazes, full of pity and hidden contempt, were unbearable. The creak of the bed, the whisper of sheets, his own ragged breathing. With each month, each year, each new dawn, these efforts became more pathetic and hope more ghostly. Time slipped through his fingers, and he felt the cold of approaching death touch his skin. The paranoia that consumed Ferdinand's final years manifested in ways that shocked even the cynical courtiers who had witnessed decades of royal madness. Late at night, when the palace corridors were drowned in silence, broken only occasionally by the creak of old beams, the heavy tramp of boots would suddenly be heard. The king would burst into his wife's, Maria Christina's, chambers, bringing with him the cold glint of steel and the rage of a madman. His voice, sharp and strained, cut through the air, accusing her of imaginary infidelities. The ladies in waiting, caught off guard, would freeze, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. They never knew when the king's trembling hands, clutching the shaft of an accusation, would point at them, when his wild gaze would pierce them through. The air thickened with fear, heavy, almost palpable. Ferdinand's obsession with surveillance reached grotesque proportions. Between his chambers and Maria Christina's, rough-hewn peepholes were drilled into the thick walls. For hours, in a stupor, the king would press himself to these openings, his single eye pressed against the cold stone, watching. Servants, passing by, would freeze, feeling the invisible gaze upon them, knowing that behind the thin slit, a mad voyeur awaited them. They saw the king's eye, pressed to these holes, as the queen nursed their daughter, as her lips silently whispered prayers, as she simply sat, lost in thought, her gaze wandering over the walls, not seeing them, but feeling the unseen presence. Maria Christina, aware of the constant surveillance, began to move through her rooms like a prisoner. Every gesture, every movement became deliberate, every facial expression meticulously controlled. She felt her own breath become alien, the walls press in, and the air around her thicken with invisible threads of control. The rituals of food tasting turned into agonizing ceremonies of suspicion, delaying meals for hours. Ferdinand insisted every dish must not only be tasted, but the tasters had to wait 30 minutes before the food could be served. 30 minutes. The time dragged on endlessly, each breath seeming like an eternity. The king watched the unfortunate servants with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned their faces, searching for the slightest sign of malaise, a spasm, a pallor that might betray a slow-acting poison. The air in the hall was electrified, saturated with the smell of fear and the heavy aroma of untouched food. Several tasters, unable to bear the unbearable pressure, fainted, their bodies slumping to the marble floor with a dull thud, only strengthening Ferdinand's conviction. Attempts on his life were imminent, lurking around every corner, in every shadow, in every spoonful. Maria Christina, caught in this web of suspicion, began to show signs of the same psychological decline that had destroyed Ferdinand's previous wives. Her letters to her family in Naples, intercepted and read by the king's spies, revealed a woman slowly losing her mind. The lines, written in a trembling hand, spoke of constant surveillance, of shadows that made her flinch, of the impossibility of trusting even her own servants. Her words were a whisper of despair. She described her life as existing in a glass cage, where every breath is monitored for signs of rebellion. Her own voice seemed to reflect off the invisible walls, losing its strength, dissolving into emptiness. King Ferdinand's paranoia, like a poisonous fog, slowly and inexorably spread throughout the entire court, penetrating the most hidden corners beyond even his immediate family. Every day, with the first ray of light, he demanded a change of his personal guard, and the sounds of new footsteps, the new creak of leather straps, the new clang of weapons, seemed only to intensify his anxiety. He was convinced that long service only bred fertile ground for bribery, for the whispering voices of enemy agents. The cabinet ministers, pale and wary, went through absurd, humiliating loyalty checks, their every nervous tick, every involuntary eye movement recorded by the king's gaze. Ferdinand, sitting in his chair, would make contradictory, disjointed statements in private meetings, as if setting invisible traps. He waited to see if his words would be corrected, listened for the slightest hesitation in a voice, and any, even the most timid objection, any hint of disagreement, was instantly interpreted as undeniable proof of treacherous intentions, feeling a cold flame of hatred ignite within him. The Spanish court, once glittering with exquisite etiquette, enveloped in a flare of cultural refinement, the envy of all Europe, had now turned into a gruesome silent theatre of mutual surveillance. Courtiers, like ghosts, glided over the marble floors, their faces frozen in masks of cautious neutrality. They learned to speak in a coded language of hints and undertones, avoiding direct eye contact with the king, feeling his piercing, all-seeing gaze upon them. Every step, every movement was calculated, as if on enemy territory, where a single wrong gesture could cost a life. Conversation shrank to a whisper, barely audible through the echoing silence of the hall, as if thousands of invisible snakes were hissing in the walls. Relationships were formed and dissolved, based on a ghostly supposed loyalty to competing factions, and everyone understood, feeling the cold sweat on their backs, that a careless word, even accidentally dropped, could result in imprisonment or exile, forever sealing their fate. Ferdinand's relationship with his young daughter, Isabella, became another most painful source of pathological anxiety. He knew she was not his biological child, and this thought, like a splinter, constantly itched under his skin. He simultaneously loved her, this tiny, innocent heiress, feeling her soft warmth in his arms, and hated her, burned by a searing shame as the living, breathing proof of his sexual inadequacy. The king would sit for hours, staring at the child, his eyes like bloodhounds, scouring her features, searching for the slightest resemblance to himself, or, even worse, to possible fathers whose shadows he imagined in every corner of the room. He commissioned artists to paint detailed, painfully accurate portraits of Isabella at different stages of infancy, and then, locked in his chambers, he would compare these images with paintings of himself, young and full of vigor, and with portraits of his wife's, Maria Christina's, former lovers, feeling a chill run to his bones. The question of Isabella's paternity tormented Ferdinand with a particular, unbearable force. It was the final, crushing triumph of his sexual dysfunction, a mockery of fate engraved on his own throne. Here she was, this girl who would inherit his crown, his great name, precisely because he, the king, had failed to produce a legitimate, blood-related offspring. The irony, the bitter, searing irony that his greatest political success, securing the succession, saving the dynasty, was simultaneously his deepest, most unbearable personal failure, did not escape him for a moment. This contradiction, like a corrosive acid, ate away at him from within, slowly, inexorably, poisoning the few fragile moments of happiness he could share with his daughter, leaving only ashes behind. A deep, agonizing uncertainty gnawed at Ferdinand. It was like a splinter under his skin, giving him no peace. He began to summon genealogists, phrenologists, anyone who could provide even a shadow of scientific proof of Isabella's legitimacy, anything to soothe the searing knot of doubt in his chest. He saw their faces, pale, with droplets of sweat on their temples. These experts, they felt, the danger hanging in the air like a thick fog. Their voices, when they spoke, were thin, reedy, their words carefully chosen to avoid offending either side, to be interpretable in any way. The A sound of their nervous coughs echoed in the silence of the study. He saw their hands tremble slightly as they proffered scrolls that smelled of dust and time. Their written reports, now lying in the palace archives, yellowed and brittle, revealed the desperate ingenuity of those trying to please the king, to save their own lives. Every florid phrase, every vague turn of speech was a cry for their survival. The king's paranoia grew like a malignant tumor. It suffocated the palace. His attempts to control his wife, Maria Christina, became ever more perverse, ever more obsessive. He appointed specific servants. He whispered orders to them. They were to watch her every move, every rustle of her letters. He demanded not just the content of her words, but the expression on her face at the very moment she wrote them. What did she feel? He wanted to know. He imagined. Her face, saw. Her eyes. He needed detailed reports on her every day. How much time did she spend in prayer? Did he hear her quiet sighs? What books did she read? Did he smell the ink? Which courtiers did she speak to during public appearances? Did he see their hidden smiles? Maria Christina felt it every touch of a foreign gaze, every imperceptible whisper. The pressure was constant, unbearable, under this intense scrutiny, trying to maintain any semblance of a normal royal life required colossal psychological strength. She learned to compartmentalize herself. A public face, serene, smooth as polished stone. She felt the muscles of her face grow stiff from the forced smile. In her private life, she struggled. Her breath hitched, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her personal diary, hidden behind a false wall in her chambers, discovered centuries later when the stone of the wall fell away with a dull thud, revealed the full depth of her suffering. She wrote of feeling like an actress who could never leave her role. Never, not even in her sleep. Even in her sleep she felt the heavy gaze upon her. Ferdinand's paranoia reeked of danger. Its international consequences began to poison Spain's diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors, sensing this cold wind of instability, reported to their governments on the king's unpredictable behavior, on the shakiness of his court. Marriage negotiations that could have strengthened European alliances stalled. A silence hung over the maps. The sound of a quill signing agreements was not heard. Potential partners hesitated, felt uncertain. Could Spain fulfill long-term commitments under such unpredictable leadership? Ferdinand's personal dysfunction became an international problem. It hung in the air, heavy as a thundercloud, ready to burst. The world for Ferdinand was distorted. Every shadow hiding a dagger, every whisper a coded threat. His mind, once a fortress of reason, now echoed with the ceaseless clang of suspicion. Even Maria Christina's gentle request, her soft murmur about redecorating her chambers, pierced him with a coldness more piercing than the marble beneath his bare feet. He saw it then, sharp and clear. Not a desire for beauty, but a cunning plot. A new alcove, perhaps, for a vial of bitter poison? A false wall to conceal a gleaming blade. The very air around her seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken intent. The court, a kaleidoscope of silks and jewels, became the stage for his torment. When the courtiers, with their polished smiles and eyes that never met his, praised the Queen's appearance, a metallic taste of fear bloomed on his tongue. He heard their words, smooth as polished stone, but his mind dissected every syllable, searching for a hidden cipher. Was radiant a signal for ready? Was graceful a code for gathering? The rustle of their lavish gowns, the faint cloying scent of their perfumes. It all became part of a complex, suffocating conspiracy that he felt tightening its grip on him. Even the solemn rhythm of religious rites offered no sanctuary. The thick, sweet smoke of incense, the low, monotonous chanting of prayers, the flickering candlelight casting monstrous dancing shadows on the chapel walls, all of it only deepened his terror. Was Maria Christina's newfound piety true humility, or a silent, dangerous communion with foreign Catholic powers, secret secrets hidden in the folds of her rosary? The price of this constant vigilance, this state of perpetual siege, was a gaping wound in the heart of the kingdom. He felt the icy breath of the emptying treasury, the phantom touch of a starving people, even as he signed decrees for new guards, new spies, new secret passages. The palace itself became a labyrinth of his fears, unseen corridors, damp with the cold of forgotten stone, snaked through its ancient bones. Complex alarm systems, a silent web of invisible wires and pressure sensors, hummed with a low, constant noise, a metallic buzzing that resonated in his bones. He tasted every meal with a sense of foreboding, watching the faces of his numerous tasters each bite a gamble, each swallow a victory over an unseen enemy. The clatter of their silverware, the strained clearing of their throats, the faint, acrid smell of their fear. This was the daily bread of his existence. Resources that could have silenced the hungry cries from the streets, that could have built a future, instead vanished into the deep, echoing maw of his unending suspicion. His body, a vessel of relentless anxiety, began to betray him. Sleep, a distant, mocking memory, refused to come. Night after night, he lay in the oppressive darkness of his bedroom, the coarse silk of the sheets chafing his skin, listening to the frantic thud of his own heart, the only sound in the vast, suffocating silence. His stomach, a knot of raw nerves, twisted with a sharp, searing pain, the bitter taste of bile a constant companion. The palace physicians whispered of nervous agitation, but Ferdinand felt it as a tremor in his hands, a relentless twitch beneath his eye, a frantic buzzing in his skull that never subsided. Every fear he embraced, every new guard he hired, every secret passage he ordered built, only amplified the next, pulling him into a tightening spiral. The walls of his own mind had become a prison, shrinking day by day, relentlessly. The last vestiges of warmth, the fragile threads of family ties, snapped under the weight of his crumbling mind. He saw betrayal, even in the eyes of his closest relatives, their ordinary gestures distorted into sinister signals. Birthdays, once occasions for sincere, if formal, affection, became agonizing ordeals. He scrutinized the bright colors of the flowers, searching for a hidden meaning in their arrangement. The rustle of wrapping paper around each gift, a prelude to a potential threat. The forced gaiety, the brittle laughter, the clinking of glasses. It all seemed hollow, a performance for his benefit. Even his brother, Don Carlos, whose steady hand had guided him through past storms, now moved in the cold shadow of Ferdinand's surveillance. The echo of their shared childhood, the memory of his brother's unwavering loyalty, now seemed a cruel deception, another layer of the suffocating, silent conspiracy that had become his only truth. The quiet rustle of silk and a child's laughter, gentle, almost inaudible, like the flutter of a butterfly's wing. Maria Christina held little Isabella close, feeling the warmth of her tiny body, inhaling the faint, subtle scent of cleanliness and lavender that came from the child's hair. But even these moments, begged for, clawed from the harsh reality of daily life, were laced with poison. Every motherly embrace, every quiet whisper, every word spoken alone with her daughter, Ferdinand perceived not as love, but as treason. His gaze, sharp and piercing, slid over them like a cold blade. He saw not a mother and child, but a conspirator and an instrument. In his eyes, a morbid gleam of paranoia. What is she whispering? What foreign words are poisoning an innocent mind? Is she preparing her for a foreign throne? This question, unspoken but palpable, pressed on Maria Christina's chest like a stone slab. A request for an hour of privacy, for the chance to simply be a mother, turned into another interrogation, another turn in his endless, invisible war. The air around them thickened, filled with an invisible but tangible fear. Maria Christina's heart clenched, feeling how even the purest affection was being turned into a weapon in the hands of madness. The palace corridors, once full of life, now seemed a labyrinth where every step echoed with an invisible threat. For the servants, whose lives were spent in the shadow of the royal chambers, every day was a trial. They were required not just to serve, but to be eyes and ears, omnipresent and unseen. The whisper of denunciations grew louder than the rustle of their footsteps. They had to watch the Queen, memorize her every move, every word, even the most innocent gesture, and then, with trembling hands, pass on this information while maintaining a mask of impeccable loyalty. The servants' faces grew pale, their eyes dull from lack of sleep and constant tension. Nervous tics, uncontrollable twitching of the eyelids, cold sweat on their palms. These were their silent testimonies. Every heartbeat thudded in their ears like a drum. The impossibility of pleasing, the impossibility of surviving in this double game of loyalty, tore them apart from within. Many could not bear it. Their places were taken by new, inexperienced faces who did not yet know how dangerous it was to breathe in this palace. An innocent, clumsy gesture, a forgotten word, the light clatter of a dropped trinket, and already they felt Ferdinand's piercing gaze on their backs, bringing with it a new suspicion, a new wave of fear spreading throughout the court like an oil slick. But nothing occupied his thoughts as much as the question that tormented him at night, that poisoned his every day, whose blood flowed in Isabella's veins. This obsessive idea, this burning, unresolvable question, turned into a mad, desperate hunt. Orders followed one after another, sharp as a blade. Compile a dossier on every man who had ever exchanged a word, a glance, who had breathed the same air as Maria Christina in Naples. Days and nights in locked studies, smelling of old paper and ink, were spent in a feverish search. The rustle of parchment, the scratch of quills, the muffled whisper of investigators. They compared facial features, looked for similarities in the curve of a nose, the color of eyes, the shape of a chin. Every stroke, every mole, every barely noticeable feature on Isabella's childish face became the subject of a mad analysis. The investigations deepened, spreading like an ink stain on damp paper. Medical records, family histories, even personal correspondence from years before Isabella's birth. All of it was rummaged through, studied, dissected, searching for the ghost of another's paternity. Every line, every word, every breath captured on the yellowed pages became part of this gruesome mosaic that Ferdinand was trying to assemble to prove his most terrible suspicion. His bedroom, not just a room, but a crypt, a repository of his most gruesome secrets, his deepest defeats. The air here was thick, heavy, saturated with the smell of old incense and dust, as if grief itself had soaked into the walls and furniture. In the semi-darkness, only occasionally pierced by a dim ray of light, silhouettes could be seen. Portraits. The dead eyes of his deceased wives, staring reproachfully from the canvases, every brushstroke a reminder of his impotence, of his inability to produce an heir. Next to them, on polished tables, strange, sinister medical devices glinted with cold metal, evidence of countless, humiliating attempts to fix what was broken in his body. None of them had helped, not one. And right there, mixed with this arsenal of despair, were piled religious relics, blackened crucifixes, decayed scrolls, heavy icons smelling of wax and sanctity. He clung to them like a drowning man to a straw, praying for divine intervention, for a miracle that could erase his shame. Visitors who had the chance to cross the threshold of these private chambers would later recall the suffocating atmosphere of desperate sorrow that clung to their clothes, their hair, their very souls. It was as tangible as thick fabric, and it was in this space, among the ghosts of his intimate failures, that Ferdinand received ambassadors, gave orders, decided the fates of nations. His voice sounded hollow, and his gaze, fixed on the void, seemed to see only the endless succession of his own failures. The pressure, it enveloped her, sticky and suffocating, like a damp shroud that tightened with each passing day. Ferdinand's behavior. His footsteps would sometimes echo unexpectedly loud in the empty corridors, then fall silent, dissolving into the quiet. Or a sudden laugh, so alien, so empty, bouncing off the walls. And now her own body was beginning to betray her. Every morning, thin, dark hairs were left on the silk pillow, on her comb. Too many. Dresses that had fit perfectly yesterday now suddenly hung like sacks, and then again felt tight across her chest. And the tremor, a faint, almost imperceptible, but constant tremor. It came from somewhere deep inside, from the very depths, and made the porcelain cup ring thinly in her hand as she tried to bring it to her lips. In public, she would press her palms to her sides, clenching them until her knuckles turned white, to hide this shaking, this treacherous pulse of her fear. The ladies in waiting, their eyes too attentive, too close, noticed everything. How she would flinch at a rustle behind the door, at the creak of a floorboard. How her gaze would constantly, nervously, dart over her shoulder, searching for something that wasn't there, but that seemed about to emerge from the shadows. Ferdinand's paranoia, like a poisonous ivy, entwined the palace, its roots penetrating deep to the very heart of their marriage. By 1832, it had reached its ugly peak. His gaze, usually empty, now flashed with a sharp, unhealthy fire. He was convinced that she, Maria Christina, was trying to poison him, not through food, not through wine, through to touch, through intimacy. Her very skin, according to his delusional logic, could be a conduit for poison. And so the inspections began. Before any physical interaction, she was forced to undergo it. The cold, detached faces of the court physicians, their hands too businesslike, their gazes avoiding her eyes, the smell of antiseptic mixed with her own bitter sweat. And Ferdinand, he was always there, his shadow, his intense, appraising gaze. He stood like a judge, watching every movement, searching for evidence of non-existent toxins on her skin. This was not just humiliation. It was an uprooting. The last living root of their marriage was torn out, left to rot under his mad, icy gaze, and the world watched. From behind the high walls of their own palaces, from behind the thick drapes of studies that smelled of wax and old paper, the European powers watched Spain. It was a spectacle from which it was impossible to look away, a mixture of compelling, gruesome fascination and pure, cold horror. In the diplomatic dispatches, written in a hurried hand, rustling in the hands of secret envoys, one thing could be read: readiness. They were preparing for the inevitable. They knew that King Ferdinand's personal madness, this festering wound in the heart of the country, made stable rule impossible. And so, secretly, under the cover of night, in whispers behind closed doors, some began to extend their hands, hands full of gold and promises, to the regional independence movements. The calculation was simple and cruel. Better to see Spain fragmented than to allow it to continue to rot under the rule of a monarch whose instability threatened the entire continent. Quiet steps, the rustle of maps, the thud of seals. Thus, slowly but surely, the empire crumbled. And then, 1833 arrived, and the body, at last, began to echo the mind. Ferdinand's physical health, It began to crumble like old, moth-eaten fabric, reflecting the invisible damage his own paranoia had inflicted. The court physicians, their faces growing ever more concerned, their whispers ever more alarmed. They noted a constant tremor, no longer a slight quiver, but a deep, uncontrollable shaking that racked him even in his sleep. Digestive problems, agonizing and exhausting, turned every meal into torture, and something else, more terrifying. His gaze, once merely mad, now often became vacant. His speech, it devolved into an incoherent stream. Words stumbled, became confused, and then suddenly erupted in sharp, accusatory cries, accusations against nameless enemies hiding in the walls behind the drapes, references to conspiracies, to secret societies that existed only in his own, increasingly disintegrating consciousness. The voice, once imperious, was now just a hoarse, breaking echo of his former power. And the end, when it came, it was almost anticlimactic. After decades of a tumultuous, insane reign, after all the dramas and convulsions, Ferdinand simply began to fade. His body, which had resisted for so long, which had for so long been a battlefield between his own anatomy and his tormented psychology, finally surrendered. It was exhausted. His breathing became shallow, almost inaudible, just a faint rustle. The skin on his face grew pale, thin as parchment. In his final days, he tossed and turned in bed, his consciousness, like a flickering candle flame, now flaring up, now plunging into a deep, dark delirium. Sometimes, names would escape his parched lips, the names of his dead wives, a call full of longing and despair, and sometimes, suddenly, his eyes would fly open, and in a hoarse, barely audible voice, he would give orders for investigations, for the capture of enemies, for the uncovering of conspiracies that had never existed. And this whisper, these last delirious words, dissolved into the silence, like smoke, vanishing forever. In 1833, Ferdinand VII finally found peace. It had eluded him for so long, slipping through his fingers for decades, and now it had come, the simple, silent peace of death. The court physicians, leaning over his emaciated body, whispered of gout, but their gazes, full of hidden knowledge, spoke of something else, exhaustion, not just of the body, but of the soul, tormented by years, no, entire decades, of corrosive sexual frustration and searing political paranoia that had eaten away at him from within like rust. A cold gloom descended on the chambers as the same physicians who had for years tried to solve the king's anatomical riddles began a secret autopsy. The sharp glint of a scalpel, the dull thud of instruments against metal. What they discovered was a cruel, grotesque joke of nature. The organ, carefully preserved for study, was of a startling length, 14 inches, and changed its girth dramatically from base to tip, just as the court had whispered, just as their own records had suggested. But far more disturbing was the sight of internal scarring, deep old deformities that made normal intimacy practically impossible. The physicians exchanged glances, and in their eyes was a bitter, soul-chilling understanding. This was it, the cause of decades of failure, decades of humiliation, desperation, and fruitless struggle. But that was not all. Beneath the layers of old wounds, under the weight of time, the autopsy revealed something far more terrible than a natural anomaly. Evidence, traces of deliberate self-harm. They stretched back to his teenage years, like dark threads woven into the fabric of his life. The king, in agonizing desperation, must have spent decades trying to perform unimaginable surgeries on himself. He had taken whatever he could find, sharp objects that burned his palm, and in secret, in the stuffy silence of his chambers, had tried to change what nature had so cruelly created. These pathetic, clumsy attempts at self-correction, performed in agony, only worsened his condition. Each cut, each scar, added a new layer of psychological trauma to the existing physical deformities. One could almost hear his stifled groans, feel the sticky sweat of fear, see his hands tremble in the dim candlelight as he inflicted pain on himself, hoping for release. The preserved organ, the medical drawings filled with observations full of hidden pain, all were sealed away. The heavy creak of a door, the dull thud of a lock, they disappeared into the dusty archives of the Vatican, where they rest to this day. Church officials, feeling a cold prick of alarm, deemed the materials too shocking, too politically explosive for public consumption. Thus was born one of the strangest secrets of state, buried under the weight of centuries. Only a few scholars who have been granted access to these dark records describe them as both fascinating and deeply disturbing. It is a window into a personal hell, hidden behind the veil of absolute power, a hell distorted by a cruel, anatomical fate. Ferdinand's death, that final breath, marked the end of an era. But his legacy did not die with him. It lived on, pulsating in the fractured, tormented Spain he left behind. Isabella II, the daughter whose parentage remained in question, inherited a kingdom shaken by the echoes of civil war, the moans of economic collapse, and the bitter taste of international humiliation. The Spanish Empire, once thunderous, dominating the world, had become a quiet, second-rate European state. Its decline, its slow fading, was accelerated by decades of misrule, by a king whose personal obsessions, his unbearable pain, had triumphed over public duty, dissolving into the rustle of history. The cold, clammy air of the Vatican cellar enveloped him, penetrating through the thick wool of his frock coat, seeping under his skin. A single beam of light, breaking through a high window, cast a dusty stripe on the chipped stone floor, snatching an old wooden cart from the darkness. On it, under a thin sheet, awaited what was left of the king. Dr. Manuel Alvarez, the royal surgeon, felt a thin trickle of sweat run down his temples despite the piercing cold. The smell of formalin, acrid and sharp, mingled with the musty scent of old mold as heavy as grave earth. His fingers, accustomed to fine instruments, trembled as he threw back the cloth. Beneath it, in a glass jar, the organ floated in a murky solution. It was pale, almost colorless, but its outlines were unmistakably recognizable. Dr. Alvarez leaned closer, his breath catching. He could hear only the beating of his own heart, a hollow and uneven sound, like the tolling of an old bell. This organ, it was more than just an anatomical specimen. It was a silent witness, a monument. Years flashed before his inner eye. 3 wives, one after another, withered and died, like flowers deprived of water, their faces, pale, frightened, appeared in his memory, and then dissolved, leaving only a phantom pain. The king, Ferdinand VII. He saw him, heard his voice, heard his laugh, empty, nervous, echoing through the palace corridors. He heard the whispers of the courtiers, their frightened sighs when Ferdinand, in a fit of inexplicable rage, threw chairs or shattered precious vases. He saw the fear in the servants' eyes, their submission, their silent plea for mercy. Dr. Alvarez ran a hand over the cold glass of the jar, a rough touch. He felt not only the cold of the glass, but a phantom touch of the cold stone on which Spain had stood in those years, a kingdom torn apart, riots, blood, poverty. All of it seemed to emanate from this pale, lifeless piece of flesh. It was the physical embodiment of a decay that had begun not with a disease, but with something far deeper, more ingrained. The king's personal shame, his inner emptiness, his inability, all of it, like a poisonous sap, had soaked every thread of the state's fabric, corroding it to holes. Oh, what a monstrous irony! He, a doctor, preserving what should have been a symbol of fertility, a symbol of procreation, and in reality, a symbol of sterility, inability, failure. This small, lifeless object, encased in glass, cried out about power devoid of wisdom, about strength perverted by personal dysfunction. How could one man, one crippled soul, cause so much pain, so much destruction, millions of fates, crossed out by a single stroke of the pen, a single fit of rage, a single inability? Dr. Alvarez straightened up, his back aching. He could hear the muffled ringing of bells from outside, high above the ground. Ordinary life went on, but down here, in the semi-darkness, another truth was kept, a truth that no one would dare to speak aloud. The truth that the king was not just a monarch, but also a victim of a genetic lottery played centuries ago, long before his birth. But that did not negate the fact that he was also a criminal, his actions metastasizing into a national trauma. This organ, it was not a curiosity, it was a scream, a silent but deafening one, a scream about the destructive power of shame, about the decay of unlimited power, about the tragic, irreparable waste of human potential. Ferdinand VII had achieved immortality, but not the kind he had craved. His name, his story, his anatomical legacy, hidden in the damp vaults of the Vatican, whispered of disturbing secrets, too human for history to acknowledge, too tragic for time to heal. Dr. Alvarez carefully covered the jar with the sheet. The dust danced again in the beam of light. He left, leaving the dead secret in the darkness, where it would wait, never disappearing, never forgotten, the silk, its smoothness, its coldness. It once clung to the broken form it had so long concealed, and even now, after time, its threads gave off a faint, cloying scent of sickness, of stale air, of something locked away for too long, too heavily. Now, it seemed, that same suffocating, luxurious shroud had fallen upon the kingdom itself, a heavy, unseen pall. Every stone felt fragile, every beam groaned under an invisible burden. The very air hung thick, saturated with the dust of neglect, tasting of decay and forgotten promises. The kingdom, like the body it had served, was broken in ways nature had not intended. Its arteries were clogged, its heart beat with a weak, intermittent rhythm. And then, silence. A deep, all-encompassing stillness descended, heavier than any before it. The ragged breathing that had so long choked the very air had finally ceased. A distant, muffled bell tolled once, then again, a sound not of grief, but of a vast, exhausted exhalation. Ferdinand VII was at peace. But what remained? A land scarred not by war, but by 1,000 hidden, deep wounds. Generations would pass like sand through a clenched fist before the faint pulse of healing could truly begin, the faint cracks in every foundation, the quiet desperation etched on every face, the low, insistent hum of a future already burdened. He had lived as a source of suffering, a poison seeping into the soil, and so he had ended. A king whose very touch left a lingering curse, a kingdom left to suffocate under the weight of his legacy.